right, today on Paradelphia, we have a very special guest with us. He is an award-winning writer, a film historian, a critic, an archivist, and a poet. His name is Steve Vertlieb, and he's been writing about motion pictures and film in a variety of different places, books, magazines, journals, tabloids, for over 50 years. Steve, welcome to Paradelphia.
Thank you, Rick. It's nice to be here.
As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we were kind of talking before we got on air, and your career has been so expansive that we could spend literally hours talking about many different topics that you've come across and people you've known in your lifetime. It's really an impressive resume.
Thank you. The only reason that it's impressive and expansive is that I'm old. Been around a long time.
Well, I read a little bit. I read a little bit about your a little of your book and a little bit about you. And it's not just a longevity thing. It's you kind of put yourself out there to meet people. You took some chances and took the initiative, and that got you in the door in a lot of cases, didn't it?
Well, it has. I mean, you have to have initiative. You can't be afraid. The nightmare, of course, is that one of your heroes is going to turn out to be a jerk, but. Right. I've been very fortunate. I'd say 99% of the heroes and idols that I've come across over the past half century have been gentlemen and ladies, and we've had very lovely conversations and experiences. Yeah. But this has been my whole life. I mean, I can remember when my dad brought home our first television set in 1950. I was all of 4 years old. And at that point, you saw the Indian head nickel that was displayed for hours before the TV would come to life around 5 or 6 in the afternoon. Right. And I sat transfixed as a little kid in front of the TV, just watching those images, and nothing has changed. I do that today.
Yeah. I mean, that was, people laugh at everybody these days looking at their cell phone, but really that was kind of, I guess, the generation that you grew up in. That was your cell phone. That was your new technology that was just wild.
Well, it was. Television was brand new. There'd never been anything like it before. It was primitive. I look at it now as nearly prehistoric, but that's part of the beloved fascination of it all. Seeing those flickering black and white images, it just takes me back to my childhood.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the before we get into our topic of the day, which is going to be our favorite anthology series from back in the day, the Twilight Zone. We want to dig into that a little bit and get your take on a lot of topical stuff that may be relevant today, and kind of dig into the making of a little bit. But before we get into that, basically, you mentioned, or we talked a minute ago about how it was the technology of the day, and you kind of took initiative to meet people like that. A few of the people that you met are guys like Ray Bradbury, Ray Harryhausen, who you had personal relationships with these people.
Bradbury was not only an idol and a hero, but a personal friend for nearly 40 years. Yeah. And Harryhausen was one of my earliest heroes, and we were friends for darn near 50 years, and I adored them both.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's amazing to have rubbed shoulders and gotten to be on a personal friendship level with people like that. Those are, geniuses in their field. Yeah. And we, as much as we are a paranormal talk show, I personally love the genre of, that old horror sci-fi monster kid, genre. And so I kind of bring that into the show a lot. We've done some work with Scary Monsters magazine.
No kidding.
East out in California. Well, they're in Arkansas now, but they were in California for a while.
I've been involved with Scary Monsters. They actually ran my tribute to Ray Harryhausen about his career and about our relationship.
Yeah.
And there's a gentleman in London by the name of Mark Mauston, who is known as the rock and roll photographer to the stars. He's photographed the likes of Billy Joel, Elton John, Paul McCartney, but he's also a sci-fi fantasy horror fan. He knew Harryhausen, and he does do interviews in the genre. And he asked me about a year ago if I'd be interested in submitting to an interview about my life and my work and career, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I agreed to that, and we did an interview, and that's supposed to be in an upcoming issue of Scary Monsters magazine.
Nice.
hopefully this year.
Yeah, that's cool. That's very cool. Yeah, that magazine, man, that brings me back to the time before. Just the aesthetics of it. I love it.
Chris, I grew up with the original Famous Monsters of
Yeah,
Toonland
yeah,
with Fari Ackerman, who was another dear friend for about a half a century. But that was the magazine that began it all. And then I was involved heavily in the Monster Times, which was the first and only biweekly monster tabloid,
right.
which was produced in New York City and began in 1972. I was one of the original writers for that publication.
Yeah, yeah. That's. I mean, again, we could spend hours talking about this stuff. I totally love the subject, and we'll definitely have to go down that road maybe another day when you come back here. But today, what I want to get into, like I said a few minutes ago, is the show The Twilight Zone. You had written a real comprehensive article about this that you had posted online. That's kind of how I came
Mm-hmm.
across you, and it was really well spoken, and it was something that it kind of dug into the social aspect and the history of that show. But before you can have any kind of a discussion about the Twilight Zone, I kind of think you have to lay the groundwork by talking about the world at large at the time when this show came into being, society wise, entertainment wise, in the late 50s. Can you lay that groundwork and discuss kind of what the world looked like in terms of post-war conservatism in entertainment at the time?
Well, conservatism is the correct word, I guess. It was certainly for me. I grew up in the 1950s. It was a time of uh, almost criminal innocence. We had no real sense of the outer world and the conflict in the world. I mean, there were things like U2 and Francis Gary Powers with Dwight Eisenhower in that period, but it was really a very conservative, restricted time. And along came Rod Serling, who wanted to shake things up. Uh, the network CBS at the time certainly had no desire to stir the waters and uh, create controversy. And so Serling was very clever in the stories that he wrote. He couched his stories in allegory. They always meant a good deal more. They went beyond the norm of sci-fi fantasy. And don't get me wrong, I love science fiction and fantasy, but he was telling moral. He was writing morality plays and couching them in sci-fi fantasy so as not to perhaps offend the general population or become overly controversial where the network would step in with a degree of censorship. But it's interesting that Rod Serling, if you look back, was not actually the original host of the Twilight Zone.
I hear this before, yeah.
He created the series, but the pilot for the Twilight Zone was actually on Desilu Playhouse, hosted by Desi Arnaz, and they had a 1 hour presentation of a play, a teleplay that Serling had written called Time Element, which starred William Bendix as a man who is visiting a psychiatrist, Martin Balsam, in New York City, and telling him about these recurring dreams that he had every night, where he'd wake up in. Now, this is 1958, but Bendix had these dreams about being in Pearl Harbor in 1941 on the eve of the bombing, and waking up each night before his death. And the dreams were growing in intensity. And he was concerned that one night he might not wake up if he'd actually been in the bombing. Uh, Fast forward to the end of the hour, Martin Balsam, as the psychotherapist, wakes up from what appears to be a deep sleep in his office, looks around, there's no one there. He's perplexed, confused, but he chalks it up to it being a dream. He goes out for lunch at a local tavern, and as he's sitting at the bar having a drink, he looks up on the wall, and there's a photograph of William Bendix, and he says to the bartender, "Who's that?" And he says, "Oh, that gentleman used to work here, but he was killed in the bombing of Pearl Harbor." And that became the pilot for the Twilight Zone, which
Right.
was sold to CBS as a series.
Yeah. Now it's interesting, that particular episode being the pilot, and in general, we talked a second ago about the conservatism of the late '50s. It's funny because people kind of slam that a little bit, and they say, oh, when you say conservatism like that, they say it um, from a modern point of view, and it does seem restrictive in our world.
Hmm.
But looking at it from their point of view, do you think that was something that maybe they felt like they earned through World War II? Like
Absolutely.
we went through this whole war, and we look back on that now, and it's history, and we know that it took place between this date and that date, and we know what happened. But
Hmm.
in time, like we are now with the pandemic, like nobody knows what's going to happen. 50 years from now, people will look back at us and go, "That was only a couple of years. What's the big deal?"
I
But
absolutely agree. Yeah.
like when you go through something like that as a society, like when you come through the other end of that, I guess you almost feel like you've earned the right to like take it easy and do things your own way, you know?
That's an excellent analogy. Certainly, the world had been in turmoil with the Second World War rather. Millions of American kids killed, scarred, maimed. It was a terrible time, and you're right. We felt we, the generic we, as the United States of America, felt an entitlement to heave a deep sigh of relief, relax, and begin to look at a more positive, relaxing, and somewhat innocent
Right.
future away from the scars of war and famine. And that's why the '50s were, as I say, a relatively innocent time. And I don't say that with any degree of condemnation or vindictiveness. I mean, I loved the '50s. I grew up I was born in 1945 in
Mhm.
December. So I was a war baby, I guess, although my dad was not in the service. But everything was brand new in the '50s. And that's what I so cherish about that period. Television was brand new. A lot of the filmmakers, the actors, directors, actresses, composers did their most creative work in the 1950s. It was like a flower being born and
Right.
an opening.
Yeah.
By the time we got into the '60s, of course, that had grown old and boring, and we entered a more explosive period,
Right.
which has not abated from that time to this. But I will always cherish the 1950s, and if you
Yeah.
ask my favorite decade for any reason whatsoever, not only in life experience, but in films and music and certainly television, that would be the time. And I grew up brand new when television was brand new. So I evolved as television evolved.
Right. And you had and here you had Rod Serling who was writing these plays and these scripts. And I imagine, again, people didn't really want to be lectured to at that point. They kind of
Hmm.
wanted to do their own thing. And here is this guy coming out of nowhere, kind of sort of lecturing them on morality.
Right.
And they didn't want to deal. They didn't want to hear it.
Serling, Rod Serling was a very deep thinker. I mean, he really was brilliant, philosophical. He had I suppose in these days you would call it left wing liberal leanings.
Mhm.
And again, I don't say that in any degree of condemnation because my political points of view pretty much sided with his and still do. But there was a message in most of the shows, and he was very aware of network censorship and was tiptoeing around them so as not to anger the censors and have the shows removed.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting, and it was basically a Trojan horse. A lot of
Mhm.
his episodes were written, like you just said, with that the morals and the morality built into sci-fi horror.
Right.
And how how and why the censors and the TV executives didn't figure that out, I don't know. Did they not? Did they? I mean, I guess that's a good question. Like, what do you think? Did they not read the scripts, or did they just not? I don't know. I'm not sure how you could miss that.
Uh, well, I mean, the shows were subtle. I'm now looking back, it's obvious what he was going for. That the shows were seldom about what appeared on the surface. They had
Right.
far deeper meanings. It's possible that because of the naivete of the late 50s and early 60s, they chose not to understand what he was trying to say, or didn't want to, because it was more. They would be getting into a more combative, explosive area and situation, so they chose to ignore it. Either that, or they were just too naive to see what he was doing.
Yeah, and it's funny because at that time we're talking about how they were so conservative with their views and didn't want to hear the moralistic preaching, but yet if the threats were physical, that was okay. You had monster movies, you had sci-fi movies, you had aliens landing left and right. That was okay. But if you had a moralistic issue, that was the problem. So that's kind of an interesting, juxtaposition where they kind of didn't really care so much about the physical threats. They were fine to put on screen.
I mean, there were episodes of the Twilight Zone that said things about humanity that we, as people, probably would rather not see. He held up a mirror to what lies beyond or beneath the surface. One of those shows was, of course, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, where aliens, the fear of an alien threat turned a neighborhood of neighbors against one another, turning into savagery. And the aliens basically leave saying, well, this is all we have to do. We don't have to invade or lift a finger. We just pose the threat and they're going to do it to themselves.
Yeah. And I think that episode, more than almost any of them, is relevant today. You see that same exact thing, and you've seen that same exact thing going on in society, social media and whatnot. You take away. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say there's also the episode, and forgive me, I can't recall the title, but the episode with Larry Gates, again, another neighborhood of friends and brothers and people going to each other's homes and enjoying camaraderie and dinner and sharing evenings. And Larry Gates has taken the precaution during the beginnings of the nuclear age of building a bomb shelter.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And then when there is a threat or a perceived threat of a nuclear attack, the people who have been brothers and sisters and best friends are literally banging the door down and ripping it apart just to get in. Civility is cast aside, and we become savages once again.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's definitely one of the themes that he touches on is how humanity can turn on a dime on each other.
Yeah. With inflation, it might be a quarter today.
But. There's a few heavy themes that he touches on and comes back to again and again and again. And one of them I noticed with a lot of the episodes in Twilight Zone, especially a lot of the earlier episodes, was this this idea that people at that time, which would have been late 59, early 60 maybe, were longing for a simpler time.
Yeah.
And how, looking back on your childhood, which to these folks would have been maybe the 30s, how that kind of affects your entire life going forward and the family and friends you have around you. One of the episodes that I really like, it's probably definitely one of my favorites, is an episode called Walking Distance, from late 1959. Basically,
my favorite episode of the series as well.
Yeah, well, I'll let you do. I was gonna kind of do a summary, but why don't you do that?
Well, again, it goes back to what we were talking about a moment ago of the sense of being entitled to relaxation and an untroubled time during the 50s. We'd earned our degree. Now it was time to relax and be with family. And perhaps that's what Rod Serling sensed was leaving us in the country. And he was rebelling and longing for a simpler time. And many of the episodes of The Twilight Zone, and if there's an underlying theme to that series, it is this, that life has become too difficult, too complicated, too intoxicating, if you will. And we're longing to go back to a time when life was simpler. The premise of Walking Distance is, and I suspect that Serling patterned the main character, Martin Sloan, after himself. Martin Sloan, is portrayed by Gig Young, is a successful but harried executive in an advertising agency. And it's as with push, push, shove, shove in the James Daly episode of A Stop at Willoughby. He's had it up to here. He can't take it anymore. There's no room for individuality. Everything is rush and push, deadlines, and he's had it. So he drives off and finds himself, perhaps unknowingly, 5 miles away from where he grew up, not even knowing that that's where he headed. Perhaps something inside drove him there, but on the surface, he's not even aware. He's just going for a drive to get out of the city. He can't take it anymore. And he asks the gas station attendant if his hometown is nearby. And he says, yeah, it's about 5 miles. You could probably walk it. And Martin Sloan says, 5 miles? Yes, that's walking distance. So he walks there and goes into the local shop where they have the ice cream floats and the sandwiches, and it's virtually unchanged from when he was a kid. And he asks for an ice cream float with a double scoop and asks the price, and the guy behind the counter says it's a nickel. And he says, you're going to lose your shirt with that. And the guy behind the counter is perplexed. Well, isn't that what everyone charges? But it takes him a while to realize that he's gone back in time. He sees himself as a little boy. He sees his parents. He's recaptured, however briefly, the uncomplicated innocence of childhood, and he reaches out and wants to unfold it and bring it closer to him. His heart is exposed, but then there's the reality lurking just behind him, that he's not really there. Something is pulling him back to the present. And his parents don't believe, of course, nor should they, that he's their little boy. He's a grown man. But he pulls out his identity cards, his driver's license, to show that he is indeed their son, Martin Sloan. Their initial reaction is shock. His father says, I guess you know things about us, things that will happen when they'll happen, meaning when they're going to die. But I don't want to, please don't tell us that. We want to live our lives. And he tells Martin Sloan that he can't invade this space, even though he wants to, even though he wants to retreat to his childhood, to a simpler time, because he points to the other Martin Sloan, the little boy. This is his time. He has a right to live it. You don't belong here. You've evolved. Let him live his life. And so Sloan reluctantly goes back to the present, but with perhaps a deeper degree of appreciation for what he left behind and what life can be if you stop, breathe, and give it a chance.
Right. And that's, you mentioned A Stop at Willoughby, which is another episode that's similar to that. That had more supernatural aspects to it. Dream, not dream visitations, but the whole stop and walk through the town of Willoughby was basically at the end of the day, it was a precursor to heaven. Right. He was dreaming about his own heaven, basically, is what it wound up being.
I mean, a lot of these shows had such a deep sense of loss and of melancholy and a longing to go back when we didn't have to worry about paying bills and job deadlines and flawed relationships, when you could be a little boy again. Just go to band concerts, as Martin Sloan wanted to do. As in the case of A Stop at Willoughby, again, he's patterned after Serling himself, working for an advertising agency, where his boss is saying, push, push. You've got to keep going at it, boy. Don't relax. You've got to move. You've got to push. And he finally has enough and screams, I've had enough, fat boy, and office and gets on the train and goes home. Or he thinks he's going home. It's snowing. It's dark. And all of a sudden, there's bright sunshine, there's no snow, it's summer, it's warm. And a conductor from another time says, Willoughby is your stop. And he gets off and sees again band concerts and something around the turn of the century, the last century, of course, with uh, just a simpler time when there was not such a race to get ahead, where you could relax and breathe. And in the end, he finally gets off at Willoughby. In reality, he's jumped off the train at night in the snow and is instantly killed. And when the undertaker comes and puts his corpse into the to the car, into the limousine, they close the back door and it says Willoughby Undertakers.
Mhm.
So he has escaped. It's up to the viewer to determine whether he's truly dead, whether existence stops or continues in a softer, gentler experience, which is what he had longed for, much
Right.
as Martin Sloan had in Walking Distance.
Right. Right. And it's interesting because nowadays, it was different back then, because when you had those thoughts and feelings as a middle-aged person back in the 1950s or 1960s, it wasn't so very different, I can't imagine, than what we experience ourselves in modern times. I know I have that. I all the time. My wife and I talk about growing up in the 1980s. What we did as kids. We were doing it last night. We watched two old 80s movies on TV. I watched License to Drive with Corey Haim. It was just a fun, goofy movie.
Mm-hmm.
But
no, of course, I'm old enough. I'm old enough to flinch when you say an old 1980s. To me, it's old as the 1930s. But.
Yeah, right. I get it. But we have that opportunity in modern times to because of entertainment being digital and videotapes and streaming now, and YouTube videos, and we every once in a while I'll throw a YouTube channel up that plays just nothing but commercials from like 30 years ago, just because it's fun to see them again. Like you goofy, like stuff you would have never in a million years. When I was 15 years old and I saw some Doublemint commercial on TV, I didn't even hear it anymore. But I look back on that now and go, man, that was cool. Like that, it brings a nostalgia to it. But we have that opportunity. But back then in the 50s and 60s, they didn't have all that technology.
Right. So
people going through that at that time, like that had to be a hell of a thing, because you didn't have any outlet for it. You know what I'm saying? Except for your own.
That's why I truly appreciate the period. I've talked to people who are older, perhaps 20 or 25 years older than I, and they've asked me, how did you become so familiar with and regard films from the 1930s and 40s with such a degree of affection? And I explained that because, in a way, I grew up in the 30s, in the sense that when television was brand new and it was desperately searching for product of any kind, and inexpensive product, what they ran was 1930s films, not only 1930s movies, but serials. People today perhaps may not remember what a serial was, a cliffhanger.
Right.
Perhaps a 15 or 20-minute short where it's an adventure film and the hero is battling monsters or criminals, and at the end appears to have been killed. But at the beginning of the next chapter, you see how they cleverly managed to escape. But we watched Hopalong Cassidy and Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers and Red Barry and Zorro's Fighting Legion. This is the stuff that I grew up with because that's all there was in the 1950s. Everything, as I say, was brand new. Uncle Milty. I can remember the Uncle Milty Christmas shows in the early 50s.
Right.
Because television was a new invention, and they were groping, they were experimenting, looking for new ways to express themselves. Live drama, certainly, Studio One, Playhouse 90. Everything was just, actors now and actresses whom we regard as major superstars largely began in the early days of television on shows like Playhouse 90. Yeah. So I hate to keep using the same term over and over again, but it was a time of innocence. And while I work still at age 75 and have responsibilities and pay my bills and maintain my car, there's a large part of me in my heart and in my head that longs to reach back to that period and on weekends when I don't have to go to work frequently does.
Yeah. Well, I do it too. I watch those movies and watch those shows. It's funny. I was actually, talking about, we were watching a movie last night. I was having a conversation with my wife that might be relevant here. I was saying to her, we had shows like we watched last night, those movies that come up, John Hughes movies in the 80s, like that spoke to who we were as teenagers.
Right.
And the generation of our parents, they had the beach blanket bingo and the Easy Rider and movies like that spoke to the youth of their time.
Right.
And even our grandparents, like you say, they had movies back in the 30s and 40s that kind of spoke to the youth of that time.
Oh, of course, I had Rebel Without a Cause with James.
Yeah. Everyone seemed to have that from the time, at the beginning of the 20th century onward, except for the last like 25, 30 years. Because if you think about that, kids who are now, I say kids, but kids who are now like 25, 30 years old, when they go to look back on their youth and try and find themselves in the movies, in the physical media of our time, they're not there. There's none of those John Hughes like movies going on now. There's none of that, Annette Funicello, beach blanket bingo stuff going on now. Like that, nothing out there right now really speaks to who these people are that they can look back and see that I'm aware of, unless I'm missing something.
No, I don't think you're missing anything. It's easy for older generations to look back at younger generations and say you could not have experienced what we did. But in a larger sense, that's true because we live in such a cold, homogenized society.
Right.
That there's very little to look back at with any degree of affection, except for war and political divisiveness and cruelty and nastiness, third world countries and a lack of humanity overall. Perhaps it's naive of me to look back at my childhood with affection. Perhaps it was like something out of the Twilight Zone. It really didn't exist except in my mind and my heart, but it formed the basis of who I am, good, bad, or indifferent. And that has led certainly to what I've done with my life. I often wonder if I've done anything of value in my life, if I'll be remembered, should I be remembered? Does anyone care? And that at 75 years of age, that's something that haunts me more and more. But then in talking to a gentleman like yourself, perhaps it gives a clearer perspective of the last 50 years or more.
Yeah.
And I can look at it perhaps through the lens of a microscope more clearly. But you're right. The kids today or the kids of 10 or 15, 20 years ago do not have that restful, tranquil time to look back at with any degree of affection. It simply didn't exist.
Right. And it's a shame. I when you get to be, 50, 60 years old and you look back at your childhood, you have your memories, but it's almost like now it's like it was back in, the 40s or whatever, when you didn't have physical media when you were younger, even though they do, which is really interesting. More but so now.
I have to wonder more and more if that essentially is what Rod Serling was portraying in those early episodes of The Twilight Zone and some of the later episodes of that longing to go back, longing to return when life was less complicated, when it wasn't as demanding, when people weren't dying early of heart attacks due to stress. And he put that in an awful lot of episodes. Yeah. Certainly one of the preeminent episodes in that, excuse me, in that storyline was Kick the Can, where a group of people at an old age home are just sitting around literally waiting to die. They have nothing to do but stare at the walls and be fed by the attendants. And in comes a happy gentleman, Ernest Truex, who wants to play a game, go back to being little kids, kick the can, get this empty can, and go out onto the lawn and kick it around the lawn back and forth at one another. And initially, the elderly people are horrified. We're old. We can't. Our bodies are old. Our bones are old. We can't do it. But the more they get involved and succumb to the charm of just letting go and being who they truly are underneath the facade of what we are as people, they become younger. Uh, Physically, philosophically, intellectually, emotionally, and at the very end of the show, they all have left the nursing home. There's not a trace of them except for a group of little kids across the street who are playing kick the can. And guess what? It's those old people who have gone back in time once again.
Right. Yeah, there's a line from the Breakfast Club. I think it's Ali Sheedy says it, something to the effect of, when you get old, your heart dies.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's kind of speaking to that in that episode is, as long as you just ignore the age is a number, and you hear that phrase, it's a cliche, but I got to tell you, and I'm sure as you get older, you really do. Like, it really does. You can go one way or the other. You can focus on that and say, oh, I can't do this because, or you can just say, you know what, whatever. I feel like, I mean, I say all the time, I feel like I'm 30 years old. Like, most of the time, I don't feel that age.
I think it's important for our emotional well-being to hold on to that part of our lives, to hold on to with a sense of endearment to that innocence and childhood. So many people today are just cold and unfeeling, and that's the general sense that we have of our country and the world at large. My friends, for the most part, and the people I choose to hang with, have that sense of juvenility, if you will, of being able to return to those simpler times. I can remember my ex-wife telling a mutual friend of ours toward the end of our marriage that living with Steve was like living with a little boy. Now, she did not mean that kindly. But over the years, as I've thought about it, I'm not sure that's such a terrible thing.
Right.
I mean, it was in her eyes and may have led to our separation. But I think to remain a caring, vital human being and have a heart and give a damn about each other, you have to. You have to have that sense of vulnerability and open up your heart to possibilities.
Right.
Which is why I've loved science fiction and fantasy, because it's all about possibilities. What if?
Yep. So another thing that Serling touches on quite a bit in this series, and it had to have been really controversial and really tough to get through into the Trojan horse and through to the people back in the 1960s, was the topic of racism. And he addresses that in a few episodes of Twilight Zone, one of which didn't even air until I believe it was 2016. You aware of this one? It was I was looking at it this morning. I've never actually seen this episode, but it was an episode called The Encounter. Whereas an American vet from World War II and a Japanese soldier meet in an attic.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I have seen that. I do.
Yeah. And they have the samurai sword that the vet used to kill a Japanese soldier is kind of pushing paranormally, supernaturally pushing them to fight when they're trying everything they can do to not fight. And it does not end well. The entire episode does not end well. But it was basically the entire episode was speaking to guilt over war crimes and how, racism on both sides of that war led to people seeing the other person, the other race as less than human.
Well, there's another show, and I forgive me, I can't recall the title, but I believe it was Dean Stockwell. It was during the Second World War, and Dean Stockwell is a very racist commander and hates the Japanese. And then through a trick of fate, per Rod Serling, becomes Japanese and sees himself through the eyes of, quote unquote, the enemy, and becomes more human, if you will, because he sees racism now being directed at him. And it's a double-edged sword, which he doesn't appreciate.
Right.
But yeah, there have been films, certainly. I think of None But the Brave, directed by Frank Sinatra, where both American and Japanese soldiers are stranded on an island and cut off from the war. And by necessity, they are forced to work together to help each other and become brothers until the war intercedes once again. They're rescued and they have to retreat to their sides and become again a part of that mass hatred that divides society. But when they were left to their own devices and had to help one another, they relaxed those petty feelings of separatism and embraced one another and helped one another and became loving and caring, and which is what we as people were intended to be. And that's certainly another predominant message in the Twilight Zone, which is perhaps why the show is a legend and a classic. And so many years, 60 years after its initial run, is still shown adoringly on the Sci-Fi Channel, on certainly New Year's weekend, and watched religiously. I watch it every year, even with the commercials, even though I have the whole series on Blu-ray and DVD and videotape.
Yeah, it's definitely it's held up over the years. And I want I don't want to take up too much of your time here. You've been very very kind to come on and give us
My pleasure.
Give us of your time here, and I really do appreciate it. But I want to ask you one thing before we wrap up here,
Sure.
and that is, do you think that a show like The Twilight Zone could possibly be done today? And what I mean by that isn't just can it physically be done or literally be done, but in this world of streaming and constant bombardment with all kinds of entertainment, you don't have that appointment television anymore like you used to have. Tuesday night at 8, you got to be here to see this. And when Tuesday night at 8 happened, the whole world the next morning was talking about what happened last night on CBS at 8 o'clock.
Right.
Like that was appointment TV back in the day, but you don't have that anymore.
No, you don't. And
I'm sorry.
I agree. That's why I don't believe it could be done today. That is gone. It's a part of history. Because everything, you only had NBC, CBS, and ABC before the advent of PBS, certainly, and public broadcasting. But those were the only channels you could watch. So it was an event. It was one of a kind. It happened at one time in our history. And sadly, although both Rod Serling and I frequently attempt to try going back, it's an impossibility. We've become too cynical. We've become too homogenized, mechanized. If you look at the attempts to redo the Twilight Zone, and there have been several, there's one right now on, I believe, Netflix.
Yeah, Jordan Peele, right?
It's interesting, but it's not the Twilight Zone.
Right.
First of all, it's color, and color doesn't work in fantasy. Fantasy has to have a black and white backdrop in order to be effective, I believe, with rare exceptions. It was a black and white world back in the 1950s.
Right.
There was no color. We put color on hold, not only in the arts, but in our personal and political lives. When color rejoined society and reared its often ugly head, that time was gone. You cannot go back. I mean, you can still do quality drama, quality television, and there's a lot of it out there. There's a lot of it being broadcast on streaming services that's quite excellent. But the Twilight Zone belonged to a simpler time, a black and white world, if you will, and it no longer exists. And that's why, as long as I'm alive, and I've lived 3/4 of a century, I think it's important. And this has nothing to do with me, but it's almost as an historian looking back at history. In this sense, I see my goal as to look back in the history of the arts, television and film, to recapture and write about it and retain that on the printed page and on interview programs like yours, so that people have a sense of what was. Because once we're gone, and once that programs and films like that are no longer shown or appreciated or valued, it's gone forever. I mean, if you look at people who were snobbish about silent films, And there are a lot of people who cannot watch silent films. They cannot deal, they're too lazy to look at the subtitles. They need dialogue. Or people who cannot watch black and white films. It annoys them. It's too much work. They're used to color. They have to see color, and they refuse to see the value of a black and white film. It's an evolving culture, an evolving world, which I suppose is what society must do in order to continue and survive. But when you lose what has gone before, you lose a part of your history. In truth, you lose a part of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And you also have to, and this is another thing with society today, you have to be able to call out problems by confronting them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think nowadays people are so afraid to say something wrong or to offend anybody over anything,
right,
that you can't, it's almost like having a rat in a closet. You kind of have to scurry the rat out of the closet and see it in order to get it out of your house. So if you just ignore the rat and pretend it's not there, it's going to stay in your closet.
Right.
But nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to put, take race, take any kind of topic. Nobody wants to put those words and images on the screen these days because they might offend somebody.
True.
Even though the context of what you're doing is trying to root out the evil in it and say, look, this is wrong. Here's why it's wrong. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like when it happens. This is what happens when you do it, when anybody does it. This is what it looks like. Does that look like crap to you? Yeah, it is crap. See, look at it. But until you bring it out and show people, they're not going to know. They're not going to see it. And that's part of the problem. That's what they did so well back in the 50s and 60s with shows like Twilight Zone. Yeah, they were controversial because they put it out there. They literally showed you, said the word, showed the racism and the sexism and the, whatever it might have been that they were trying to confront. They showed it and said, here it is. It's wrong.
Well, no matter what you say, no matter what you do, it becomes suspect. Someone is there to, and we see this to a great degree in the local, or rather the current political climate. That no matter what you say or do, it's perceived by some group as corrupted and morally decayed and wrong, when the individual who said it or did it simply was trying to do something good and be helpful. Right. But we're all so afraid to be real, to be ourselves, that we become so uptight and withdraw and retreat into our individual shells and don't interact with our brothers and sisters right across the hall. And certainly now we have an excuse. It's called COVID-19. Well, that's forcing us not to interact with people. Is it? I wonder. Or is it just an excuse not to be real?
Yeah, it's a good point.
That's why shows like The Twilight Zone bring us back to what we can be, what we aspire to be, and what we truly could be if we simply let down our guard and open our hearts and be real.
Right. Well, Steve, I want to thank you again for coming on. It's been a pleasure, and I know you're a busy man, and again, I really I do appreciate you giving us some of your time. Is there anywhere people could go to find out any projects you have going on, works that you've done, things you've written? I know you've done a million different things, so if there's anything you want to let people know to look at, please.
Well, I just did a show with a gentleman named Rick Pruitt, which, if it's available, I hope it will be on Facebook or online. I hope people will be able to see it. I told you earlier, I believe, about the interview I did with Mark Mauston in London, that maybe we talked before. I don't know if we discussed that on the show. There's a gentleman named Mark Mauston. He's in London. He's known as the rock and roll photographer to the stars. He's photographed the likes of Sir Elton John, Sir Paul McCartney, Billy Joel, many others. But he's also heavily into fantasy, science fiction, knew Ray Harryhausen, as did I. And Mark occasionally does interviews with people in the genre. And about a year or so ago, he asked if he could do an interview with me. He thought I had an interesting story to tell. And so we did an interview, and it should be in the pages of Scary Monsters magazine sometime this year. I hope, knock wood.
Cool.
So that's something to watch out for. And if you check out my Facebook page, I'm always putting things on there, hopefully writing new articles and trying to get them out to the public. But I'll keep you posted.
All right. All right, Steve. Again, thank you very much. And we will definitely have whatever links you provide in our show notes, and we'll direct people to any future projects you have. Let me know, and we'll definitely post it on our social media.
Thank you, Rick. I've enjoyed this. I appreciate your having me on, and look forward to speaking with you again in the near future. You take care, and God bless, my friend.
You too. Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.